Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone that is gathered here for this special colloquium today, held as part of our graduate recruitment weekend. We have a couple of e-colloquium house rules up here, rules and reminders. Closed captioning is available through the live auto transcription. Unfortunately, we cannot guarantee the accuracy of the transcription. Please accept our sincere apologies. To enable the captions, click the CC button located at the bottom of the screen. The question period will be conducted using the Q&A function today. And if you have any technical issues, you can relay them to us through the chat. So I'm going to read a land acknowledgement for us. The Department of Linguistics recognizes the University of Michigan's origins in a land grant from the Anishinaabeg, including the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, and Wendat. The university continues to exist on the historical territorial land of Anishinaabe people. Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabe, and belong to the Algonquian language family. Oh, excuse me, this is the languages. Okay. Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabe-Moan and belong to the Algonquian language family. There are currently 12 recognized Anishinaabe tribes in the state of Michigan and many Anishinaabe people living throughout the state and interacting at the University of Michigan. So my name is Cherry Meyer, and as an assistant professor here in the departments of American Culture and Linguistics, and as someone learning more and more every day how the lessons of sociolinguistics and the power of language ideology are incredibly invaluable to working with understudied languages, it is my true honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jessi Grieser. So Jessi is an influential scholar in the field of sociolinguistics whose work profoundly emphasizes the intersection of race, language, and identity, particularly within African-American communities. She is also making her mark with language research on the wondrous World Wide Web. Jessi is an alumnus of Georgetown University, where she completed her master's and doctorate in sociolinguistics. And we are so happy to have Jessi here as the associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Michigan. Prior to this appointment, she was an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where her rigorous academic work and outstanding teaching were recognized with numerous awards. Jessi's research endeavors have been substantially supported by significant grants, including a notable $1.2 million award from the National Science Foundation for a project titled Understanding and Identifying Digital Black Grief. Her scholarly output is reflected in a host of influential publications, central to which is her acclaimed 2022 book, The Black Side of the River, Race, Language, and Belonging in Washington, D.C., published by Georgetown University Press. The seminal work encapsulates her dedication to unraveling the intricacies of language as a marker of community and belonging. Her second book, The Language of Professional Blackness, has been accepted by publications of the American Dialect Society. Through her career thus far, Jessi has no doubt experienced a spectrum of triumphs and gained many lessons from the ebbs and flows of her journey. Her dedication to the field is matched by her commitment to the growth of upcoming scholars. Many of you will undoubtedly draw inspiration from her words today. Her talk, aptly titled The Art of Invention, promises not just an exploration of the intellectual quest for the holy grail of the doctorate, but also a roadmap to nurturing your own creative and academic potential. This talk is uniquely tailored to those at the precipice of their doctoral journey. So today, Jessi will share a bit about what it truly means to embark on a PhD beyond the pursuit of knowledge into the cultivation of scholarly character and that much less often emphasized state of joy of loving what you do. So to our prospective graduate students and to all present here today, ready your minds for an enlightening experience that we hope will resonate with you throughout your academic and professional lives. Please join me in extending a thunderous, welcoming applause to Dr. Jessi Grieser.
Thank you, Cherry. That was terrifyingly flattering. And I hope I live up to expectations. And so in order to live up to those expectations, I am going to do something that you never should do, which is to start a talk with a question that you need a very specific answer to, and then you need to build off that. This can often fall absolutely flat on its face. In the classroom, that can be very productive, where someone just gives you a completely off-the-wall answer, and then if you're on your toes, you can build off it and do that. I don't recommend starting a talk with such a thing because I actually do have a place that I need this talk to go, but I'm going to do this anyway. And so I'm going to ask this question, if in no small part because at least some of you have read the abstract and probably have a sense of where I might be going. What is the thing that you're scared of at the beginning of a PhD? And you can answer this if you're a brave visiting student. Those of you who are already here, you can kind of think to where you are or where you've been, or faculty members. What's the big thing looming over your head that you're thinking about starting a PhD? Daniel, want to go for it? Can I do, but specifically, what is this? The work, the ideas, the generation, right? This big thing, the what that you got to finish? The dissertation, right? How do I come up with a dissertation and write an entire book-length thing when the most I've ever done up to this point is maybe a bachelor's thesis, right? So I was thinking about what talk I wanted to give. I get the impression, so I'm in this very weird position, y'all, for you who are new. I'm a 2-time boomeranger. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the talk, but this is my 3rd time at U of M and my 9th year at U of M, but only my 2nd year on the faculty. So I know like bupkis about this department. I know a ton about the university. And so my impression of this talk is that it is very often a recent hire giving their job talk. And I was asked to do this, and I said, Acrisio, I'm on sabbatical. I don't, like, no thank you. Can I get out of this? And it became immediately apparent that I probably could not. And I knew, it's like, I'm going to end up wasting a week, like fine tuning something. And I said, okay, fine. If I'm going to fine tune something and I'm going to give a talk, I'm going to give a talk that I really want to give. And a talk that I really want to give to the audience that is specifically here. And so I decided that what I wanted to talk about was invention. Invention is a term that comes to us from rhetoric, and I'm going to need to move these captions away so that I can see my notes. Maybe will you pick up? There we go. Oh, this is just going to be interesting. Okay, so I decided I wanted to talk about invention. Invention is a term that comes to us from the field of rhetoric, and it is the term for the process of idea generation. So I'm going to use myself as a case study, but everybody, if we take the time to dig into our stories, every single faculty member, every single scholar you come into contact with has a story that's something like this. My goal is to give you an idea of what the PhD looks like, what it means to get one, and then what comes next in the journey as an early career scholar. These first several slides and the overall organizing structure of the talk come from a piece that I really enjoy called The Illustrated Guide to a PhD by Dr. Matt Might, who is a professor of computer science and internal medicine at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And his journey from becoming a professor of computer science to also being in internal medicine is really interesting. It is well worth going to his website and reading. I found it when I was in grad school, and I found it really useful for talking about what a PhD is, what it is that we're all about, to other PhD students, to my family, to people who have no idea what this is, and now these days to my own students. And Matt Might generously allows us to use his slides and his drawings via the Creative Commons. So now you get to experience it too. So what's a PhD? It is a stuck slide is what it is. There we go. That is a PhD. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. All right. Imagine a circle that contains all of human knowledge. By the time you finish elementary school, you know a little bit. By the time you finish high school, you know a little more. And with a bachelor's degree, you gain a little bit of a specialty. If you get a master's degree, you've deepened your specialty. And I'll take a moment to point out, for those of you who are visiting, we have admitted all of y'all with either a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or sometimes more than one master's. So y'all are here. Then you go to PhD school and you take classes and you read and you write and you hone that specialty until you get to the edge of human knowledge. And when you get to the edge, you focus and you push. We're going to talk about my journey to the edge and what happened once I got there. And we're going to start with that first little bump. So my bachelor's thesis, it's 20, one more year, it will be able to drink on its own. Blind and deaf people know you're gay, performing gender and sexuality on Will and Grace. As you notice, it was submitted to the English department here at U of M. It came out of work from my language and gender class that I had taken the previous winter. It was a weird time for straight and gay identity. In 2003, lots and lots of people were closeted publicly. There were almost no gay people and lesbian people in the Michigan marching band when I was in the marching band. We have a whole lot of LGBTQ Michigan marching band alumni. Right? This was not a thing we were talking about in 2003. The Ellen DeGeneres show was on, and Ellen had just come out on the show, and it caused the ratings to plummet. So it was a big deal to have this show on NBC. Will and Grace was the first mainstream show on primetime television to have a gay character at the center of the show. This was a thing. And there was a lot of to-do around the fact that the actor who played Will, Eric McCormick, was a straight man. The character of Jack was portrayed by Sean Hayes, who was one of the original physical comedians, who was not publicly out at the time, but later married his male partner of 8 years in 2015. So I started this thesis in a class that was taught by Dr. Ann Curzan, who is now the dean of LSNA, and got some help from her and also from Robin Queen, who is the only person in this department who actually did know me as a sweet little doe-eyed undergrad. And they both gave me some really important ways to think about this. Together, they helped me narrow down my thinking to looking at the sociolinguistic performance of gay identity. Specifically, what I was interested in was the fronting of velar nasals. So who's saying running, who's saying talking, and what is that doing for the performance of different kinds of identities on the show? Some of the most salient places that I could find information about this were performances within performances. So unfortunately, I couldn't bring a clip of this because this predates YouTube by a very long period and no one has clipped this particular clip. But what's going on in this scene is that Will has insulted Jack and his very effeminate, showy kind of persona. For going to the gym, and basically has said that Jack is too gay to go to the gym. So then Jack shows up at the gym in what he perceives as a straight way of going to the gym. But he is doing very effeminate caricature gay man thinking about what he thinks a straight man looks like, and you're getting like Titus Andronicus levels of inception happening here. Suffice it to say, there are no velar nasals in this picture. So ultimately, I concluded that the ways that people were doing language on this show were being used to create several categories of gay male identities, instead of just the stereotypical performative, effeminate gay male stereotype that had been sort of the stock character on TV up until that point. So this brings me to invention strategy number one. The world is changing. Something different was happening with how we were thinking about LGBTQ identities in 2003. So if the world feels different, can linguistics tell us why? As I mentioned, this is my second time at the Employed by U of M rodeo. I used to work for the LSA Honors Program as their student services assistant from 2006 to 2008. I had a lot of freedom to choose what I was doing, and I also got to work with some really whip-smart, fabulous work studies. One of them, Marianne Coleman, introduced me to this. Forvo, all the words in the world pronounced. Forvo was a Web 2.0, and yes, we used to call it Web 2.0, a Web 2.0 corpus created in 2008. And at the time that I was doing the work on this, it had 67,000 pronunciations in 198 languages. It is still active today. It has over 6 million words pronounced in over 430 languages. And the way that this worked was somebody would record a pronunciation, and then other people, and they would say where they were from, and other people could give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And so you could get an aggregate rating for how people felt about a given pronunciation's goodness. And that was the only scale on which they were rating this. Is this good? Is this not? And I thought, hey, this is cool. It's kind of like a grassroots perception survey. And I stored it, and I was applying to grad school and so on and so forth. So I mentioned that I worked with Dean Curzan. This is because I was in the English department, not in linguistics. Because I had an English major and not a linguistics major, even though I was pretty good at sociolinguistics already, like you try and take 3 classes with Ann Curzan and not know your way around sociolinguistics, you cannot. They forced me to take Introduction to Sociolinguistics when I started my PhD. And I said, all right, fine. Much in the same way of this talk, I'm going to get something good out of this if I need to do it. And so I thought of this database that I was so interested in. Also, by the way, the slides that you're about to see are actually from November 2008. This whole thing works a lot better if you stay pretty organized and have a good organized system for saving all the work that you do from now on so that you can draw it in the future. For those of you who are visiting, do it on your plane ride home. For those of you who are here already, we are already ruining your Friday night. You may as well go home and address your files. Most of the rest of this talk is reusing old slides. So what you're seeing here actually is my old talks folder, which you see goes all the way back to the conference where I presented this talk in 2009. So I looked at this database and I did a basic analysis of the kinds of things that were causing higher and lower scores. I had some acoustic findings. For instance, if you just flat out make a bad recording and you cut off the initial sound, people are going to rate that lower. So consider something like this.
Table.
Or
Kira Knightley.
That's Kira Knightley, right? And that whole initial consonant was missing. Versus something like this.
Treasure.
Or
Kerfuffle.
So certainly the quality of the recording has a lot to do with what people like. But there were also some really interesting social expectations embedded in people's ratings. So for example, people are a lot more happy to hear the name of this state sounding like someone who might be from there.
South Carolina.
And we get that nice South Carolinian pronunciation in the monophthongization of the ow and the I. But what was most surprising was that it also extended to the kinds of things that people were talking about. So for example, people are a lot more happy with a pronunciation from someone who sounds like they might know this guy.
David Beckham.
versus someone who sounds like they've never heard of this band.
The Beatles.
So I started getting some ideas about sound and social meaning and things, the ways in which people are interacting. So this is invention strategy number 2. If there's something you want to play with, find a productive way to play with it. My student had shown this to me almost a year earlier, or maybe 8 months earlier, and I found an opportunity to use it in my class. I played with the thing, and I wrote a paper, and I took it to New Ways of Analyzing Variation 38, where I discovered another key part of this overall invention strategy. Apply a good craft beer. This is shorthand for make friends. Now, mind you, this is not a keg party vibe. We are not going out and getting blasted. I want you to think like this dark, smoky bar. You've got either a very expensive cocktail or really nice, like dry hopped something or other. You've got your pinky finger in the air. You're throwing around words like Silverstein and indexicality. That's the idea. So I had some beer with some buddies from Penn, and they turned out to be the people who were tasked with putting together the N-Wave proceedings volume. And I got asked to submit. Now, we would like to think that this is a pure meritocracy and that what we all do is we sit around and we just type up our papers and then we eventually send them off and people tell us if they're good or not, and then we eventually get published. Some papers do get published that way. However, a lot of academia runs on relationships. Relationships run exceptionally well on alcohol, or on caffeine, or on boba, one of the above. We will come back to this. So that was year 1 of grad school. In year 2, I hit the requirement to stop. It's important to occasionally look up and have a moment to ask a question about who you are as a scholar, what are the things that are fascinating you, what you think is important. Most grad programs do this via a comprehensive exam, a qualifying paper. In this program, we write 1 qualifying paper. At Georgetown, we wrote 2. So I was asked to stop. I super enjoyed that the AI designer in PowerPoint thought that field work happened in a field, so I just kept it suggestion. But so here I am in grad school, keeping my head down, doing my assignments, knowing that I have this qualifying paper thing looming at the end of year 2. And for fieldwork class, we had to do 2 interviews to practice interviewing. And we were all studying the same neighborhood. So we'd gone out and we'd canvassed the neighborhood. We'd been talking to people. And there was this very outgoing barber who kind of like talked to all of us. And several of us were kind of realized that we'd met this same guy. And so a classmate and I asked permission. We said, well, can we conduct one of our sociolinguistic interviews that we have to conduct for this class? Can we do it together and interview him? So we did. Here's some information about the 2 of us. Interviewer 1 was in her mid-20s, was female, was raised in Cincinnati, Ohio in an upper middle class white family. She attended an all-girls high school run by the nuns of the Ursuline order and was white. Interviewer 2 was in her mid-20s, was female, was raised in Cincinnati, Ohio in an upper middle class white family, attended an all-girls high school run by the nuns of the Ursuline order, and is African-American and white. It's me. I'm interviewer 2. But of course, we were in class. So my buddy Sarah had to leave and go do her second interview. I had already done my second required interview for our class requirements. So we had an hour of this guy talking only to me, and an hour of him talking, or an hour of him talking to both of us, and then an hour of him talking only to me, into what he sort of perceived kind of erroneously as being a same race audience. For the fieldwork class, all we had to do was construct the interview and code it and conduct it. But I had another class coming up the following fall in variation. And I thought, okay, I have this very interesting interview where this very weird thing happened. And I decided to look at what variation happened in that interview. I decided to look at 2 variables, post-vocalic R deletion, which is more common in African-American language, and interdental fricative stopping, which is more common in African-American language. So for the interdental fricatives, I found that he was, in fact, a lot more likely to do it in his same race audience condition. And so he's using the African American language version a little bit more in that second hour. Notice too, I mentioned this slide is from 2009, that I was still calling this standard and non-standard then, which is both a reflection on the field and a reflection on sort of things I hadn't learned, militancy I had not yet picked up, right? And then I also looked at post-vocalic R deletion. And with R, I found actually the opposite, that he did a little bit less of it, of the deletion, when he was talking only to me. So it was suggesting that in the second half, he was doing something that might have been more like, okay, this other Black person sounds like this, and I'm going to allow myself to sound like her. So I stopped and I looked around and I formed this paper into my first qualifying paper. So what did I find? Well, I found still sound, right? Going all the way back to Forbo. I'm interested in sound. Still performance and sound, like my Will and Grace work. And now I've added another dimension, race. I must like these things. Interesting. Now, I did not have an answer about why the two behave differently. More on that in a second. But what I did have was something interesting, and I ran with it, which brings me to strategy number 3. Sometimes you will collect neat data. And what can I do with this data is a very generating idea. Then you have conversations with reviewers. When you polish your work, you'll end up sending it out. And this leads to other kinds of idea generation as you go back and forth with reviewers. In this case, I sent this work to the Journal of Sociolinguistics, and the reviewers weren't crazy about it. The idea of the paper and phenomenon is observed as relevant, although in my opinion, the article still seems to be at a point lower than expected. There are some problems in the formal structuring of the paper and the argumentative presentation, availability of quantitative data, as well as in the methodology. The author over-relies on general descriptions of AAE, but does not specifically cite studies that have examined the features of interest. They would do well to consult Grieser and any of the chapters in Leidenhardt. All right, so y'all, these reviewers were not wrong. So reviewer 1 was certainly picking up on the fact that I had not done the level of revision that I needed to do to take this from something that I had written as a graduate student and really turn it into a paper that made sense for the Journal of Socio. Reviewer number 2, who later discovered over more craft beer, is Nicole Holliday, was in fact correct. If you recall, when this paper was written, it was written by Grieser 2010. Turns out that Grieser 2010 did not have access to the brilliance that was Grieser 2015, and would have done well to revisit my own work 5 years in the future when I went to send this out. So as I mentioned, I didn't even try to publish this until I was in my first job. But then after getting these reviews, I had bigger fish to fry. More on that in a second. And so I actually just set it aside. During grad school, however, remember that this was qualifying paper number 1. During grad school, I went on. So between my first and second semesters of grad school, my friend handed me the Twilight Saga. She thought that I would not like it. The joke is on her. Or probably it's more accurate to say that the joke is on me, because she read the series, watched the movies, put them back on her shelf, and never dealt with them again, like a normal person. I, however, am now 16 years and about 500,000 words worth of fan fiction into this mess, and it is not over. So I was spending a lot of time online and getting into arguments with people about inane things and also very serious things. And basically every night when I was done with my studies for the day, writing fan fiction and talking to people back and forth on forums. And as I was doing that, I was noticing that the arguments often looked like this. That should say Elaine and Leopard, who are the pseudonyms here. There's this incredible back and forth involved in arguing online. You quote the person, then you refute them point by point, then you quote another piece of their argument and you refute it point by point. And this back and forth goes where sometimes this stack gets 3 and 4 deep of people quoting each other. So I'm participating in these discussions, and also I'm still in coursework. So enter my seminar on intertextuality that I took in the spring of 2010. Suddenly, I had a new theoretical framework. Intertextuality is all about how we draw in others' voices and create cohesion in the things that we are talking about. How do we rely on a prior text and incorporate that prior text to our current text? In what cases do we have echoes of other people's voices? So here's a new framework. Here's this thing that I'm doing otherwise. So I start asking myself, okay, what can this tell us about how these arguments are unfolding? And what does that tell us about online culture more generally? If you read the fine print on that vampire slide, this is where that happened. And this is my other piece of urgent advice. Give presentations on plenty of sleep. I was supposed to workshop my data in this course on one day and take over the entire class. And on the day that I was leading the workshop, I had gotten about 3 hours of sleep. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to make a handout. I'm just going to print out one of the things that I'm going to be analyzing, and I'm just going to print out the whole live journal post, and I'm going to hand mark it up, and then I'm going to copy it and hand it to the class. So that's what I did. Printed out the post, copied it, gave it 8 copies, passed it out. I was analyzing the comments. I was geeking out about the comments. I was directing everybody to the comments. What I forgot was that the beginning of that thing was a post that contained a chunk of a chapter of a fic, not mine, that was very, very X-rated. Thankfully, Dr. Heidi Hamilton is the consummate professional. She said nothing. My classmates also said nothing until after the class, at which point in time they let me drown in my own mortification. So be careful when you present your data. So I did that, analyzed it, wrote the work for that course, and I applied intertextuality theory to the arguments that people were making and discovered some really interesting things. So in particular, when we talk about toxicity on the internet and you read the literature, it's very often about male-male interaction or male-female interaction. We very rarely talk about female-to-female interaction on the internet, and it's perceived that women are somehow nicer to each other. Intertextuality reviewed, this is not true. It's just that women do it differently. And it's just as claws out. And so in particular, I discovered that the phenomenon of white knighting is not a particularly gendered phenomenon, and that the act of riding in to protect someone is actually something that happens in the back and forth intertextual relationship. So that brings me to invention strategy number 4. Apply stuff you're learning about to things you're already deeply involved in. You'll have the knowledge of the thing that you're studying from your deep involvement with it, and your new application will teach you new things about the theory you're studying, as well as allow you to take your ideas forward in a new way. This one I also sent out early in my first job. In this case, I sent it to the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, and I received a pretty thorough revise and resubmit, and I spent a lot of time on the revise and resubmit and ultimately got rejected. But in the process of that, I got introduced to an entirely new literature on sort of the anthropology of digital media. And it was really adding that literature to the work that I had already done that made it a perfect fit for Language and Internet, where I sent it next and where it was published in 2018. So qualifying paper number 2 took me to the edge, and then I started to focus. This took me back to that ooh data from before. Remember that I had an open question, which was why those 2 variables behaved differently in that data from Peter. So in my variation seminar, I went back to that data to try to figure out what was happening. And I broadened it out to a few other interviews that were happening among the Georgetown grad students in the overall project we were doing on DC. And I found that what people were talking about in their interviews was a major driver of what was happening with their interdental fricatives. In particular, they were more likely to use the African American language variant when they were talking about race and language versus when they were talking about any other topic. So now we're getting to some interesting intersections. Notice all the way back to Will and Grace, I'm still interested in sound. All the way back to my QP, still interested in race. But now I'm starting to think about race and the ways that it's implicated in doing other kinds of identities like language. So this is invention idea number 5. Sometimes you won't be able to fully answer your question the first time. Shelve it, come back to it later, swing at it again. So at this stage, you're trying to become a hedgehog. This is the hedgehog concept from Jim Collins's book, Good to Great. It was published in the mid-2000s, and it's about sustaining businesses and like what makes businesses resilient. And he was talking about business and how to build one that lasts, but it's applicable to personal life and it's also applicable to academic work. What is the thing that most sort of scratches your itch? What is the thing that you are most well trained for? And insert in that third circle cell for this is a problem that other people in my discipline are going to care about. The intersection of those 3 things is your hedgehog spot. And once you are there, you may experience divine intervention. So there I am, I'm interested in race and sound and place and topic-based variation. I'm thinking about my dissertation that's coming up next, and I'm studying TH fortition in the African American community in DC. And then I went to hang out with a friend of mine who was a visiting assistant professor at American University and her boyfriend who was in the Air Force. I bring that up just to point out the fact that these people are like not linguists in any way, shape, or form. Her boyfriend had the Washington Post delivered every day. And so I showed up to come visit them, and there's the paper lying on his doorstep. I pick it up, and the headline is, "Gentrification covers Black and white middle-class homebuyers in Anacostia." I did not realize at that time that a decade's worth of work had been delivered to my doorstep, or rather to someone else's. I thought, if I'm interested in race, and I'm interested in class, and I'm interested in what's happening at the intersection of the two, I've got to check out a place where Black people are becoming the gentrifiers and moving in and see what's going on there. So this is invention strategy number 6. You have questions, you have techniques, you found your hedgehog spot, you have a sense of what it is you're about, and that enables you to see when you've got that last little thing. It might be a methodology, it might be a community, but knowing the things that you know allows you to see when the missing piece shows up. So I went out like a good little variationist and started collecting sociolinguistic data. I collected interviews from 18 speakers in Southeast, and at that time I was interested mostly in the question of class, and also, as you'll remember, interdental fricative fortition. So what do gentrifiers sound like? What do the middle class residents sound like, et cetera? So I gather all my data, and this is Southeast, by the way. I gather all my data and to do all my interviews and do my transcription, and looked at a couple of sociolinguistic variables, in particular, interdental fricative fortition, and final consonant devoicing, and also in morphosyntactic features of African American language. So for devoicing, coded all of my data, and I figured out that devoicing was happening more often when people were talking about things like school or work, and realized that it was doing something like sort of educated, right? I pronounce my endings, and therefore I have this sort of educated persona that I can put on. It's part of the reason why it seems to be becoming a marker of middle-class Black English. It is simultaneously a feature of AAL, but it also has this higher order meaning of I'm smart and I'm educated and you should take me seriously. And so it kind of does this very interesting in between. I also looked at morphosyntactic features, and I found that it got used very often differently by topic. And so topics that were a little bit more about race were more likely to use African American language. And also that it got used in the setting up of contrasts, us versus them, DC versus suburbs, African Americans versus whites. And for those same reasons, it's commonly found in critiques of the neighborhood and its change. So you've heard me say the word intradental fricatives a whole bunch. Well, you might remember that I started on the DISC journey by looking at those. And I utterly gave up on that chapter. I was ready to throw something at a wall, and I was also running out of time and funding. And 100% cried on my mom, or cried on my mom. I cried on the phone to my mom. She was not physically present. And she goes, well, you could just cut that chapter. And y'all, I was like, you are harpist. You can't tell me what my dissertation is supposed to be about. People, we cut that chapter. It was fine. I finished the thing and they let me defend it. Look how much less gray hair I have. So I defend and I finish. And we can talk about the job market in Q&A or over dinner, but I ended up finding a job that was a really good fit for me. It was at another big major state university in an English department like the one where I had started to become a linguist at the University of Tennessee. And it had only one major problem. They wanted me to write a book for tenure. So this is invention strategy number 7. Sometimes being forced to put a different structure on something forces you to think about it differently, forces you to reach into it differently, forces you to do some analyses and some work that you might not do. And it can take you to really interesting places. I spent 2018 turning my dissertation into what I thought was a book, and I sent it out. Meanwhile, the job had another problem. I had money for traveling every year, but I could only use it if I was accepted to conferences. I am writing a book. I don't want to go to the LSA meeting every single year and just talk about the same book that I'm writing. So I was constantly and annoyingly kind of 3/4 of the way baking projects so that they could be presented as a poster or a talk. And I could use my travel money to go see my friends and have some time talking to other linguists. This led to a backlog of stuff. This is a real live screenshot of my writing queue from the day I made this slide. We can also talk about this queue in the Q&A or over dinner, but notice the number of things that are in those left-hand columns of planning and data gathering. Those are the projects that I started in order to see my buddies, and they got a little ways there, and then I set them aside so that I could keep writing my book. And then I sent it out. I nearly marked not recommend publication above. I only didn't because I think this has the potential to be a nice little volume. If the author is willing to put in the work to reorganize, rewrite, and substantially pare down the text, it would be a contribution to the field. I'm concerned that the author will attempt to revise what's here when in some ways I think lots of sections ought to be started over from scratch in order to get the organization right. That's rude. And also, even the more supportive reviewer at least panned my title. So I did what any logical person would do upon having a reviewer tell you that your book sucks and that you should rewrite it. First, I cried. Then I rewrote it. And I ended up with 1/2 of one chapter that remained, that was in version number 1. And I wrote 5.5 brand new chapters and 3 entire analyses that didn't occur in the dissertation or in the original book. It did end up becoming a really nice little volume. I leaned on my ethnographic skills. I leaned on my discourse skills. I wrote a book that made sense, and I wrote a book that made sense and is meaningful to the community that it's about, which meant a lot to me. And I changed the title to something a little sexier. There was just one weird thing about it. To make the book into something that was accessible to a broader audience, I leaned on those discourse skills, and I had to remove all of those pages upon pages of quantitative analysis of sound. No one's going to know about final consonant devoicing or interdental fricative stopping or any of the things that I was interested in with more of my sociophonetician hat. But that left a whole bunch of stuff that was not in the book. And I didn't get rid of it. So while the first book was actually in production, I ended up with an opportunity to publish everything else as the publications of the American Dialect Society 107. I do not recommend publishing 2 solo authored monographs back to back. I especially do not recommend doing so at the same time that the department you'd really love to work for more than anything in the world gets the go-ahead from the provost to make a hire. That was a hard year. But now I get to act like I'm the John Grisham of academic publishing, and I just like whip out a book every February, except that my next book will be coming out right now. So there's that. But I ended up publishing these 2 books back to back. Meanwhile, all that time I spent hanging out with people, getting to know people, making connections across the field, we'd been slowly building up steam. So one of the folks that I hang out with is Tyler Kendall from Oregon, who did a rotation as the program officer at the National Science Foundation. So when 2 people came to him and they had a failed application to study Black grief online and expressions of Black grief, they received feedback that they needed a Black language specialist before they really undertook that work. He suggested me. So 2 people I had never met before asked if I might be willing to step in on their grant. And that's how I ended up working with people at Columbia and Penn on Black identity and AI and online language, and get to put $1 million on my CV. They give money to computer scientists, y'all. You should get to know some. And in another case of divine intervention, ChatGPT showed up 1 year into our grant, and so we've shifted our focus to incorporate a little bit more about that. We published 1 article from this grant in fall of 23. We've got 1 going out this month and 1 going out next month, and a conference talk in July that hopefully will generate yet another. I also made friends with the linguist Paul Reed, who was originally from Tennessee. We decided to collaborate on a study involving Appalachian and Black speakers. We're just starting data collection on the first experiment from this one, but the application itself has also led to some really interesting findings about the ways that multiple negation is changing over time in the Black community, and I'm working on an article about that right now. So interesting work comes out of collaboration. There's also another big way that ideas find their way into the world now that I am a grown-up and fully employed. In most instances, in academia, you are expected to also teach. Teaching can lead to interesting conversations and interesting new things to look at, interesting students to work with who themselves have interesting ideas of things that they want to do. Sometimes you can even research teaching itself. I met some people who were equally interested in teaching and our goals as teachers and how to improve in ways that are scholarly informed and empirically tested, and got asked to be part of an NSF-funded faculty learning community where we were studying the scholarship of teaching and learning and trying to expand the capacity for that kind of scholarship in the field of linguistics. We've been together since 2019. So far, we've made a web resource for linguistics teachers, which we created at the beginning of the pandemic when everyone was suddenly being shifted online, that is freely available. We're in the process of creating a new peer-reviewed repository for linguistics teaching so that people will be able to get credit for doing things like developing big projects that people can then mimic at other universities. Many of us have done our own independent projects on the scholarship of teaching and learning. We have planned 2 conferences and are working on a 3rd. And our first major collaborative peer-reviewed article is coming out this summer in Teaching American Speech. And also somehow, teaching has led me right back to where I started. This is like my favorite pun, y'all. I hope you appreciate it. So, Will and Grace rebooted in 2017 in a totally different environment for how we're talking about and dealing with LGBTQIA identity in the media. You might remember that in 2017, I was busy writing the first failed manuscript of a book about Southeast DC. I had always wanted to do something with this reboot because what a cool opportunity to compare the iterations of these performances in these 2 different social milieus. Well, somebody handed me a course for this upcoming fall called Language in the Media. And so I decided a week ago that now is a really good time to back up 20 years and start analyzing what's different, using little baby undergrad me as a starting point, with plans to at least be able to talk about some of this data in this course that I'm planning for the fall. Sometimes teaching generates research. It also generates a really good excuse to binge watch a new show. So like I said, this is a story that is unique and not unique. It's unique in that, like, of course, you're not going to publish the exact same papers that I've published. Of course, your track through this program, it's going to be this program. Your track through this program or whatever program is going to look a little different. Your influences are going to be different. But I think in academia, it's important for us to find that hedgehog spot and become the person who is known for the thing that you are known for, that we tend to overemphasize our own special paths. So we're all out here trying to be clear, and we miss the fact that there are some generalizable principles that we can learn from people's journeys. So here are a few. Number one is be curious. Ask questions about the things that interest you. Go down rabbit holes. Spend a whole bunch of time reading something that isn't from your assignments. I forgot to mention that a lot of my dissertation came from a book that just happened to be on sale at Barnes & Noble where I worked in the evenings. And I picked it up and I read it, and it formed the backbone for how I was thinking about Black communities at the time. Number two is look for connections. That's connections between your data and new kinds of analyses, between your data and other data, between one course and another. But also look for people connections. Find your beer buddies. Some of the people in my world are in my world because we did this. We did this visiting grad schools thing together, and we ended up at several different places. And 15 years later, we're still friends, commiserators, collaborators, and in this together. Number three is embrace detours. Don't be afraid to take detours, and don't get stymied by things that seem like roadblocks. Sometimes you're going to discover a new way to look at something, and that's worth doing. Sometimes you're going to do something that's outside your wheelhouse. I knew nothing about LLMs or NLP before I started this collaboration with the folks at Columbia and Penn. That's going to lead to new ways of thinking about stuff you're already doing. Shelve projects and come back to them when you have a new perspective. Number four is take feedback. Note that I called this conversations with reviewers. You don't actually get to have an actual conversation, and that's probably a good thing because usually what you want to say contains a lot of profanity. But your side of the conversation happens as you reshape what you're doing to respond to the feedback that you get. And it enriches your writing, it sharpens your thinking, it leads to better scholarship. Number five is find your hedgehog. Remember the combination. The thing that's going to accelerate you is the intersection of what you are uniquely good at, what you're uniquely inspired by, and what the field desperately needs to hear. Pay attention to those first two within yourself and get feedback and read widely to figure out what the third is. And finally, six, have a life. Friends and outside interests are central to this endeavor. And not just because, oh, they give you a distraction or they allow you to have balance. Like, I am fully in favor of balance, y'all. You should have balance. But honestly, I'm suggesting this for a far more self-serving reason. A lot of the times, your interests and your genuine friendships are the things that are going to bring you back to the thing you want most, which is to do good, impactful academic work. In other words, growing human knowledge in an interesting and meaningful way. So that brings us back to our original question. What is a PhD? You do your coursework, and you write up your QP, and you read stuff, and you collect your data, and here you are at the edge of knowledge pushing. And one day, the boundary gives way. And that little dent you've made is called a PhD. Of course, the world looks rather different to you now. So don't forget the bigger picture. Keep pushing. And I think we have left the allotted time for questions. For those of you that are online, I gather that there is a Q&A feature that you can use. And for those of you in the room, I gather that there is a Q&A feature that you can use. I see Don's hand.
Hello. This is actually a little bit less about content. I was wondering about your queue that you showed us because it looks great. It's very organized. So
Yes,
if you would like to share more.
absolutely. We'll actually back it up so that you can peek at it. Where are my buddies? There we go. I'll put this one up. I'm happy to show this to y'all at any point in time in larger form. This is actually, I borrowed this from Carrie Ann Rocamore, or it's actually really David Brunsma who writes with Carrie Ann Rocamore. Carrie Ann is the founder of the National Center for Faculty Diversity and Development, which is an outstanding resource, which all of you here at U of M have access to the basics of. The Brunsma Research Queue is a system of keeping track of where different projects are in their completion and having all of the information that you need. So she actually suggests a physical version where you clip all of the things that you're doing to a clipboard and hang the clipboard in a wall and move the clipboard along. I'm more of an electronic person, and so I have something more like this. This goes out about 8 more columns. So I have things that I'm planning. I have things that I'm currently gathering data on, things that are actively in draft. I have another column here that is draft almost finished. So where I'm doing some sort of polishing things, getting feedback from reviewers. I have a column for things that are under review and one for things that are in press. And then my very happy column, I never delete the things once they've been published. I delete them if I decide, well, actually, no, I don't even delete them if I decide they're not there. I just scoot them back. Like this is that rejected Journal of Socio paper, for instance. So I just move them back down the queue if I decide to shelve them for a little while. But it allows me to keep track of what's happening and to occasionally remind myself that stuff has gotten done because you will lose sight. And it helps keep track of all of those things. So, and this is something I am more than happy to share. I do this in Asana. Some people do it in Trello. Some people do it with sticky notes on their walls. All of those are great techniques.
Thank you.
Dom, I was expecting you to bring it with a question about sparkly vampires. You've let me down. We should have you use the mic so that people online can hear. I was like, do I have an extra one? There we go.
Very, very great talk. Thank you so much. I have not laughed that much in a long time. But I had a quick question. One thing that resonated with me was your step of have a life. I wanted to know how you, at the time of starting your PhD, what did that step look like at that time? And then now, as you have very much fleshed out your career, so much further than that first bad review, what does have a life look like now, other than the bells?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one is the relationships. And so keeping in touch with people, even going so far as like emailing, I know exactly who gave up their position at Georgetown that opened up the funding line that I ended up using to go to Georgetown, because we had gotten each other's email addresses when we were all visiting. And then we sort of shared like, oh, here's where I'm going, here's where I'm going, here's where I'm going. That then opened the door for us to continue to stay in touch and say, hey, I'm going to NWAVE, you're going to NWAVE, I'm going to LSA, you're going to LSA. Does anybody know about this conference? And so on. I have a Facebook group that consists of a lot of those friends who were all at about the same career stage. And we've supported each other throughout our time as assistant professors and going up for tenure. Now about half of us are tenured and half of us are not. Some of us have changed jobs. So cultivating those relationships, finding opportunities to see people, that also includes like when you are traveling for conferences, you might, I mean, y'all, we're going to fund you you're gonna have money, but you ain't gonna have that much. And so you may find yourself taking extended road trips to get places with your grad school buddies, and you may end up stopping along the way and seeing people. And so cultivating those sorts of relationships has been super important and also productive. And also not stopping doing the things that you enjoy. And so, you know, I tripped into fan fiction backward, and it sustained me throughout a lot of my grad school career. It was a cheap, like completely free thing that I could do. And so I could go home every night and have conversations with people online. Of course, it turned into some academic work, and so was productive in that regard. I met yet another set of people who have relationships that I've continued on. It also continues to be sustaining to this day. Y'all, 15 years later, people are still like hand binding my fanfic and putting it on Instagram. Like, I just saw one 3 days ago. And like, let me tell you, on a day when you're feeling really bad about your academic output, stuff like that keeps you going. And music has been an on and off piece for me. I've really enjoyed that about coming back to U of M and coming back to Ann Arbor. I spend a lot of time playing music and that sort of thing. So the balance is important. Like I said in this talk, though, what I'm emphasizing is that these things that might feel like they're only there to give you balance, or they're only there because like, oh, I'm supposed to have a separate thing, can also be very generative in terms of the work that you're doing. The other thing that outside things do is they give you an identity beyond your scholarship. And that's very important. This is hard work. This is grueling work. This is work that will eat away at you if you let it. Being able to have multiple senses of, okay, I'm a linguist, but I'm also a flutist. I'm also a novelist. I'm also a photographer. I'm also an erstwhile scuba diver. All of those things, let a bad linguist day not ruin everything else. And so all of those pieces are important to have. Andrew.
Thank you for the great talk. You would have heard me cackling during the reviewer section. My question is about that. Having been a recipient of a similar comment from a reviewer about the paper needing to be read by a mother tongue speaker of English,
Oh, of course.
because it was about
Great.
African languages. Do you have any advice for dealing with the particularly sharp reviewer comments that may or may not have a basis in reality?
Write vampire fan fiction? You think I'm kidding. But so further on my journey, further back, I was a creative writing major, or at least thought I was. And I ended up in history of the English language in 2002 as a way of sidestepping the pre-1600 literature requirement that our English department has. History of the English language counts here. I tried to get it to count at Tennessee. I shall not go further into that story. They didn't count it there, but they do count it here. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to take a class in English language, and it's going to count for this, and then I'm going to go get my creative writing degree. Here at U of M, we, at least at the time, and I think it is unchanged, we only accept a small number of students into the actual creative writing major. There's 5 fiction writers and 5 poets. The year that I applied to be a creative writing major, 8 people, including me, thank you very much, but 8 people had won our undergraduate fiction prize. And so obviously 3 of us were not getting in, and I didn't get in. But that was actually after I had taken history of English and ended up kind of going, wait a minute, like this linguistics thing, this sociolinguistics thing is really scratching something, and is really telling me something about who I am and what kinds of things I care about, and then kind of begged Ann Curzan to take me on as a thesis student so that I could write that Will and Grace thesis. However, one thing you learn as a creative writer is that a lot of times your reader won't be able to put their finger on what it is that they don't like. and they're going to tell you something that's completely off the wall. And this is why I made the joke / non-joke about fan fiction, because at least reviewers are actually kind of like reasonably nice about it, even when they're rude. Like fan fiction writers will just tell you that you suck and that like your mother should die. Like, I'm not even kidding. In creative writing, you learn to sort of look around that and go, okay, like clearly I am a native speaker of English. What is this saying about this person's expectations for someone who is working on African languages? How much of that is them? How much of it might be something that I didn't make clear in the writing that led them down this path, that led them to say something that was cruel? And so that's a lot of what I do when I get reviews, is I'm treating them just like they are like a 13-year-old who's replying to my fanfic without knowing anything about it. Very often not knowing that they are talking to a 40-something professor. It's kind of fun. And so you kind of look around and figure out, okay, where's the truth? Which might not be, not only might not be what they said, but might not even be anywhere close to what they said. Like they might be responding to something and not really know what it is that's kind of making them uncomfortable or making them have that reaction. It's up to us to figure out what the reaction is. And sometimes it is gonna just be on them, right? They're having a bad day, but that process can help. I have heard of the strategy of having other people read your reviews and having them summarize them. I have never felt the need to use that because I have this writing workshop skill, but that's a good strategy. And another good strategy that I do use when I'm breaking down reviews, it comes from Get a Life PhD, which is a wonderful blog, now kind of dormant, but has quite a few good posts. And she has a step-by-step process for doing a revise and resubmit, where you take each thing that has been said by the reviewers and turn it into an actionable item. And that's also where you discover the things that are not actionable. And that's where you kind of go, and this is a you problem. And then you find the thing that like, oh, no, I can do something about that. That's a me problem. So those are some of the things that I do.
That was such a fantastic talk. It was so much fun. Thank you so much. What I really want to ask you is how multiple negation is changing, but I'm going to ask what might be more relevant for the audience, because I'm hearing you mention several kind of meta sources about graduate school. And I'm really impressed that you read so widely about the processes you're going through. I also know that some of those sources can just sound devastating. Like they're unhappy people having a really hard time. And so I just wonder if you have any advice about the kind of meta level graduate student, early career, those kinds of sources, or sources about success. Like how do you discern what is useful in those? Do you find yourself regularly coming to those? Are they recommended by the community you mentioned, or kind of what's your approach that leads you to and engages you with those sources?
Yeah, I think part of it might be me. I tend not to take on the things that want to be 100% doom and gloom. And so one of the things that I certainly encourage, especially in my advisees, and y'all have all suddenly become my advisees, including my colleagues. Hello, you're my advisees today. That you take what works and you jettison what doesn't. This is also true of reviews. You take what works and you jettison what doesn't. And you might try a strategy. So, I always recommend the translation of how to respond to a revise and resubmit from this blog, as I found it tremendously useful. It is not useful for everybody. And so like, if you're brand new at this rodeo, try a technique once and then let it go. Very often those sources lead to other sources. So for example, if you're reading a blog, you might be introduced to, okay, we'll get a life PhD quoted this thing from the professor is in, and the professor is in, who I adore and also cannot stand for her sort of white lady, like unexamined white lady privilege. And so I can kind of like set aside the unexamined white lady privilege and see what parts of the advice work for me as a Black woman who has to work through this whole system in a really different way. And so it's that sort of back and forth of these sources that that's really useful. I probably should have made a slide of all of my stuff, but come see me. I'll put it together on my website or something of different things that I go to. And I will go to one thing and leave it alone for 5 years and come back to it later and see what kind of advice works. I was giving the advice the other day, I won't say who to, but that some of us are binge writers and it works, y'all. And that's a thing that nobody tells you in academia. We're all told, oh no, you're supposed to write every single day and sit down and make a ritual where you write for an hour or 2 hours every day. And a lot of us go around feeling the same way we feel about flossing our teeth. Where like, I know I'm supposed to do it. I don't do it as often as I'm supposed to do it. Maybe some of you do, please don't tell me. But we have this like guilt that we are not the kind of people who sit and write 30 to 60 minutes every day. And we have this feeling that that's how that's supposed to happen. Deborah Tannen, if you do not know her, and if you do know her, you know that she's a pretty well-respected linguist and also the only New York Times bestselling linguist that I now can take that back. Gretchen McCulloch is now in this esteemed group, and I don't count John McWhorter, who is the only pair of New York Times bestselling linguists that I know, right? She's a binge writer. She writes most of her books in like 2.5 months and then lets it sit and lets things cogitate for another 2.5 to 3 years. And then 3 or 4 years later, she spends 2.5 months going down into her hidey hole and writing another book, all pretty much in one shot. You take what works, you observe your own way that you're working and try and work it in between.
I also want to thank you for an awesome talk. This is not so much this isn't a question, it's just a comment on how I think that, so you kind of like framed thing as like, yes, we all have our own individual journey, our own flavor that we will move through the PhD program with, or the whole process of getting a PhD. And so when you had so we all have our own individual things, but everything that you outline is like stuff that most people will experience, I think, if they do things successfully. And when you had the slide up that was about divine intervention, I laughed, as I laughed many times during your talk. But because I'm just sharing a bit of my own journey, that the breakthrough that happened that allowed me to push through my dissertation was like me sitting down at my laptop at like 3 a.m. being like, I'm totally tired of doing work. I'm just going to sit and watch Netflix for a while. But I opened up my laptop and there was my work looking at me. And I was like, I just started reading, because whenever I see words, I just start reading, which is why I don't like decorating with words. I just start reading. So I just started reading. And all of a sudden, because I'm so tired, I had this creative aha moment that just propelled me through the rest of the dissertation. And so there were many points in your talk where I was like, yeah, that was me. Yeah, that was me. That too. And so I just want to say that I really appreciate that you took the time to lay all of this out for everybody and give us a good framework for people thinking about what their PhD process is going to look like. So I just wanted to share that it resonated, and thank you.
And thank you for adding another layer. So yay. See, I didn't lie.
Okay, we have an online question from esteemed Zoom guest Nicole Holiday.
Hey, reviewer, AKA reviewer one.
She compliments you profusely, apologizes for being reviewer two that one time, and wants to ask about your strategy for long-term time management. So sometimes we're so excited about an idea that it's all we want to do, but we have other things that we need to get to in the meantime, like a collaboration or a QP for a student. So in a normal week, how do you split time between rewarding yourself with fun projects and doing ones that you have to do?
Mhm. I mean, as I mentioned, I am more of a binger than not. And so I do often go very deep on one project for a short period of time. My first, like that 2018 White Knighting paper, I continued the path of not getting much sleep that term. FYI, for those of you who are on the younger side of this audience, your ability to go through a night not sleeping drops off like real suddenly between 27 and 29. Just like be prepared. Like it is literally overnight that you will no longer be able to do overnight. And so I wrote most of the first draft of that paper. Now that paper went through multiple revisions, including the one after I sent it to JLA, where someone said, hey, I want you to like incorporate this whole other literature. And I incorporated this whole other literature and they rejected it anyway. I'm not bitter. And the so I very often go very deep on a project for a good period of time. But I also have lots of strategies like the one that is being my little holding slide here, where I have a spot to stick stuff that I need to park. I mean, really specifically, I write in Scrivener. And Scrivener allows you to gather your documents and things like that. But the tool's not particularly magic. The part that is magic is having the stuff in one spot so that you can drop it when you need to drop it. And the further you get in your career, the more you will need to drop things, because you will have something that's urgent. You will have, you go on, like your doctoral student is having a meltdown, and you need to help them out of that meltdown so that they can go on and continue to do wonderful things, right? And so having the ability to park and come back has been very important. And then within any given week, it's like thinking about what that week is going to look like and where pockets of time occur. You will find that alcohol plays a disproportionate role in my academic life, but I also treat myself to a glass of wine every Sunday night and sit and work through my week. And I have this little ritual with myself where like I look forward to it, because it's this little treasured moment where I can go through and go, okay, I've scheduled these two things on top of each other. I need to email this person. I'm going to have some time this morning on this day to work on this project. This other one looks like it might set on fire. So I'm going to like reserve some time. And then I know kind of where the blocks are, so that if I do have to move something because something becomes urgent, I know that originally I had thought, I'm going to need about 3 hours for that on Thursday. Well, Thursday blew up, so I'm going to need to find 3 hours for that someplace else. And that's been pretty useful. I don't work very late in the evening either. Like that's been a thing that I've mostly been able to keep once I started needing to sleep when I turned like 29. So either that or I've just outed myself to all my new colleagues as a slacker. We'll see.
We have one other question online from Ezra. So one source of research inspiration he's found is when he disagrees with something he's studying.
Mhm.
And asks if you found anything similar. Like, there's no way that theory is right. Even I could write a better theory.
So far, no. One is because I think sociolinguists are a very generous bunch. And so we tend not to get into fisticuffs with each other intellectually or in person. However, I will say many things get driven by, I want to read this. And no one has talked about this in quite the way that I want to talk about it. And so that has been pretty generative for me. And that led to a lot of what's in the Black Side of the River. In that case, I was almost arguing with myself, where I kind of went, the first draft of this book didn't actually talk about the stuff that I thought was important, or especially that my speakers thought was important. That I had recorded them so that I could get their interdental fricatives and they wanted to talk about their neighborhood. And then I was given, the way that I will talk about it now, I was given that wonderful opportunity to rewrite the entire book, thanks to reviewer number 1. And so I like looked at that and said, okay, like my speakers told me what was important. I'm going to argue with myself here a little bit and actually write about them. I will, however, say that I have a Spite PhD, actually I have Spite tenure. So there is a professor at the University of Utah who fancies herself a professor of Twilight fan fiction, and she's actually a scholar on Kafka, like that's her real thing, and she became known for her work with Twilight fanfic when 50 Shades of Grey came out. And I looked at her and I said, I think I was like in my 4th year of my PhD at the time. I looked at this chick and I went, if someone that dumb can get tenure, and so off I went with the confidence that I too could make that happen. And so I kind of owe it to her. So didn't argue with her intellectually. She doesn't even know that I'm in this fight, but gave me a lot of sustenance to go on.